What happens when this most dangerous man in Atlanta owes his dignity to a broke college girl with $2.50 and nothing left to lose? She didn't know his name, didn't know that half the city moved when he made a phone call, didn't know that men had disappeared for looking at him wrong. She just saw someone stuck, and she helped. No cameras, no motive, just $2.50 pressed into a stranger's hand on a Tuesday morning when she could barely afford to eat. That single moment set off a chain of events that would shake an entire city, destroy a billion-dollar deal, and force the most feared man in Atlanta to choose between his empire and his soul. If this story hits different, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bus was running 4 minutes late, which meant Amara Brooks was going to be 7 minutes late to her 8 a.m. statistics exam, which meant she had approximately zero margin left for anything to go wrong. She stood at the corner of Northside Drive and MLK, one earbud in, one out, watching the 71 crawl through the intersection like it had all the time in the world. Her backpack pulled at her left shoulder, laptop, 3 highlighters, 2 textbooks she hadn't finished reading, and a Ziploc bag with 4 crackers and a packet of peanut butter because she'd skipped dinner again last night. The November air was sharp enough to make her eyes water, and she'd forgotten her gloves somewhere between her grandmother's kitchen and the front door, and now her fingers were curled into her sleeves, knuckles already raw. She did the math in her head the way she always did. Compulsively, automatically, the way some people check their breathing. Rent was 3 weeks away. Her scholarship disbursement wouldn't post until the 15th, which was 9 days from now, which meant 9 days of making her current account balance, $41 and change, stretch across bus fare, groceries, her phone bill, and whatever her grandmother's pharmacy copay turned out to be this month. She had $2.50 in quarters at the bottom of her bag specifically for this bus ride. She had already spent yesterday's lunch money on a transit card reload she'd miscounted. $41. 9 days. This exam. Keep moving. The 71 pulled to the curb with a hydraulic sigh and the doors folded open. Amara stepped in behind an older woman with a rolling cart and a young guy in scrubs who smelled like antiseptic and coffee. She tapped her card. It beeped green. She exhaled. She was already scanning for a seat toward the back when she heard the argument begin. "Sir, the payment didn't go through." "Try it again." "I did try it again. 3 times. It's declining." "That's not possible." The voice was low and flat, not loud, but with a particular quality that made the small space feel smaller. Amara turned her head without meaning to. The man standing at the fare terminal was tall. Not just tall, but the kind of tall that reorganized the space around him. Dark overcoat, charcoal suit underneath, the kind that didn't have a visible label because it didn't need one. His jaw was sharp, expression controlled in the way that people who were accustomed to never showing discomfort had long since mastered. Korean, she guessed, maybe mid-30s. He was holding his phone over the reader again, jaw tight, and the driver, a tired-looking woman named Diane, according to the placard, was staring at him with the particular patience of someone who had seen every version of this. "Sir, I have other passengers. You need to either pay or step off." "I'm telling you the technology is malfunctioning. I'm telling you it's declined 4 times. The people behind him in the narrow entry were starting to shift. The young guy in scrubs made a sound under his breath. Amara watched the man with the phone try again, watched the terminal flash red, watched something flicker behind his eyes just for a fraction of a second that looked less like anger and more like a man who had suddenly and completely lost the script he'd been running his entire life. It was the lost look that did it, not his clothes, not his face, not any particular thought she had about what was right or decent. It was just that she recognized something in him in that moment. The specific shame of being caught without, in public, in front of strangers, and her body moved before her brain could stop it. She pulled the Ziploc bag out of her backpack, pushed past the guy in scrubs, reached into the front pocket where she kept the quarters wrapped in a hair tie, and she pulled them out and dropped them into the fare box before she could think better of it. Clink, 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 clink. Exact fare. "She's good," Amara said to Diane, who looked at her with mild surprise, and then at the man, and then she just shrugged and closed the door. The man in the overcoat didn't say anything immediately. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her. And Amara was already moving toward the back of the bus because she did not have time for this. She had a statistics exam, and whatever expression was on his face right now was not her problem. She found a seat beside the window and pulled out her notes. He sat down across the aisle. She noticed in her peripheral vision that he sat very still. Most people on buses fidgeted, checked their phones, adjusted their bags. He just sat there with his hands in his lap and watched the city move past the window like he was doing some private internal accounting. After 3 minutes, he spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Amara said without looking up from her notes. Silence. "How much was that?" $250. Another pause. "I'll pay you back. Don't worry about it. I don't accept debts." She looked up at that. He was still watching the window, but there was something deliberate in the phrase, like he'd chosen it carefully and meant every word of it in ways she didn't have context for. "It's $250, she said. "Not a debt. It's a bus fare." He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark and steady, and she had the sudden, irrational feeling that he was the kind of man who had never in his adult life needed anything from anyone, and that the last 15 minutes had genuinely disoriented him in some deep and unfamiliar way. "Your name," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Amara," she said after a beat. He nodded once, slowly, like he was filing it somewhere. Then he looked back out the window and said nothing else for the rest of the ride. He got off 2 stops before hers, without looking back. She made it to her exam with 4 minutes to spare, sat down, and put him entirely out of her mind. She had more important things to survive. Amara Brooks was 22 years old and had been quietly drowning since she was 17, not in any visible, dramatic way. She went to class. She worked her shift at the campus coffee counter 3 days a week. She called her grandmother every Sunday, and sometimes Wednesday if she had time. And she sat in the front row of her finance seminar and took notes, and raised her hand when she knew the answer, which was most of the time. From the outside, she looked like a young woman who had it together. Inside, she ran constant calculations about whether having it together was even survivable. Her mother had left when Amara was 9. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way water erodes stone, a little more absent each month, until one day she just wasn't there anymore. Her father had done better for a while, had worked construction, had kept a small apartment in Vine City where Amara had her own room with a window that faced the street. Then he'd gotten sick. Then he'd gotten better. Then the construction work dried up, and the better became a different kind of worse, and he was in Macon now with a cousin, and Amara had moved in with her grandmother Evelyn at 16 and hadn't left. Evelyn Brooks was 73 years old and had lived in the same house on Ashby Street for 47 years. She had raised 3 children in that house, buried a husband from that house, watched the neighborhood change around her 7 times in 4 decades, and never once talked about leaving. The house smelled like cedar and old coffee and the particular mustiness of a place that had absorbed decades of living. The furniture was dark wood and worn velvet, and photos on every surface. Family graduations, church anniversaries, community picnics stretching back to the 1980s. Evelyn's neighbors were people she'd known since their children were in diapers. She knew which of them had medical issues by the pharmacy bags left on porches. She knew which marriages were struggling by the lights left on too late. It was the closest thing to stability Amara had ever known, and it cost money she didn't reliably have. Her scholarship covered tuition and a partial housing stipend, but it was merit-based and required a 3.4 GPA, which required her to pass every exam, which required her to study, which required her not to work too many hours, which required money she didn't have without working. She had solved this equation imperfectly for 3 years by working exactly 1 hour more per week than was recommended, sleeping 6 hours when she needed 8, and eating 1 full meal a day with strategic crackers. She had not told Evelyn any of this. Evelyn had her own pharmaceutical copays and a heating bill that spiked every winter and a list of small house repairs she'd been deferring since the previous spring. The last thing Amara was going to do was add herself to that list. She did the statistics exam and got it back the following Tuesday with a 91 marked at the top in red pen. She put it in her bag. She went to work. She bought a small coffee with her employee discount and ate her crackers in the break room and thought about nothing in particular. She did not think about the man on the bus. She thought about him 3 weeks later when she was sitting in the Career Center on campus, applying for internships she mostly didn't believe she'd get, and she came across a listing for a summer analyst position at a company called Kang Global Holdings. She almost scrolled past it. The posting was brief, almost aggressively sparse. Summer analyst position, corporate strategy, competitive compensation, downtown Atlanta office, application through corporate portal only. No flashy language about disrupting industries or building the future, just a clean black and white job listing that looked like it had been written by someone who found enthusiasm distasteful. She clicked the link mostly because competitive compensation meant a number significantly better than her current hourly rate, and she needed a summer position that would cover Evelyn's air conditioning bill, which was not a small thing in Atlanta in June. She filled out the application that night at the kitchen table while Evelyn watched her game shows in the other room. She uploaded her transcript and her 2 letters of recommendation and a resume that she had revised 11 times across 3 years. She pressed submit and went to bed. She got a call 12 days later asking her to come in for an interview. She said yes without looking up the company's revenue, its CEO, or anything about who ran it. She was too tired for optimism. She just put the date in her phone and bought a dry cleaning token for her interview blazer and moved on. Kang Global Holdings occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on Peachtree Street that reflected the downtown skyline so cleanly it looked like it was trying to absorb the city around it. The lobby was marble and silence. The receptionist had the specific posture of someone who had been trained extensively on how to assess people without appearing to. Amara announced herself, gave her name, said she was there for the summer analyst interview. The receptionist's expression didn't change, but she picked up the phone and murmured something, and then she asked Amara to take a seat, and Amara sat in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent and looked at the corporate art on the wall, large format photographs of cities at night, Seoul, Singapore, Atlanta, Dubai, and thought about the answers she'd rehearsed on the MARTA ride over. She was good at interviews. She knew this about herself, not because she was charming or polished in the way that some of her classmates were, the ones who'd done Model UN and debate and had parents who ran things. She was good at interviews because she'd learned early that most interviewers were actually listening for honesty and they could hear when it was missing. So she answered questions honestly, including the uncomfortable ones, and she didn't perform confidence she didn't feel, and she had a very precise, quietly fierce way of making her point that she'd inherited from Evelyn and never quite managed to sand down. She was shown into a conference room on the 32nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made Atlanta look like something someone had built with care. There was water on the table, still and sparkling, and a tray of untouched fruit, and 3 chairs on one side and 1 chair on the other. She sat in the single chair, pulled out a notebook, uncapped her pen. The door opened. 2 people came in first. A woman in her 40s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a man in his 50s with a gold watch and the efficient movements of someone who had sat in on thousands of these meetings. They introduced themselves. The woman was director of corporate strategy. The man was head of talent acquisition. They sat down. They opened folders. The woman asked Amara to walk them through her background. Amara began to answer, and the door opened again. She heard him before she saw him, or rather she heard the room change, the slight shift in atmospheric pressure that happened when certain people entered spaces, the way the director and the talent acquisition head both subtly straightened without seeming to realize it. He sat down at the head of the table, which put him at the far end and slightly to her left, and he set a single folder in front of him without opening it, and he looked at her. He was wearing a different suit today, dark navy, no tie, and he looked like exactly what he appeared to be in this room, which was a man for whom this building was the least interesting thing he owned. But she recognized the jaw, the stillness, the eyes that assessed without performing assessment, the bus, the quarters, 250. He didn't react. He didn't smile or nod or give any signal that he recognized her, and for a long, tilting second she thought she was wrong, thought she was imposing a narrative on a stranger's face. Then she saw it. A fractional change in the line of his mouth, something contained and deliberate, and she understood that he recognized her perfectly and had chosen not to acknowledge it. The director asked her to continue. Amara continued. She talked about her coursework in corporate finance and quantitative analysis. She talked about the independent research project she'd completed on housing development economics in rapidly gentrifying urban corridors, which she'd written specifically because it was real, because Vine City was real. because she'd watched it happen in real time from Evelyn's front porch. She talked about what she understood about community impact assessments and what she thought was missing from most corporate-led development narratives. She was clear and specific, and she didn't apologize for any of it. The man at the head of the table didn't look at his phone. He didn't write in his folder. He just listened, and the quality of his listening was unusual. It had weight to it, the way certain kinds of silence had weight. And Amara found herself talking more directly to him than to the other two, which she hadn't intended and couldn't quite stop. After 32 minutes, the director thanked her and told her they'd be in touch. Amara thanked them, shook hands around the table, and picked up her notebook. As she reached the door, his voice came from behind her. "You did research on housing displacement." It wasn't a question. She turned. He was still seated. The director and the talent acquisition head were both looking at him. "Yes," Amara said. "In what neighborhoods?" "Vine City, Pittsburgh, English Avenue. I grew up there." Something moved behind his eyes. Brief, controlled. "We'll be in touch," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been on the bus, low and flat, and carrying that particular weight of someone who never wasted words because they'd learned early that they didn't need to. She took the elevator down alone, stepped out into the Atlanta November, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the city noise moving around her. She had a feeling she was going to get the job. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The offer came 5 days later in an email from the director of corporate strategy, with a compensation figure that made Amara read it 3 times to make sure she hadn't miscounted the digits. She accepted within the hour. She didn't tell Evelyn the salary number because Evelyn would worry about what it meant, and Amara wasn't sure yet what it meant either. She started on a Monday in January, 2 weeks into the spring semester, in a role that required her to be downtown 3 days a week. She was assigned a desk and a bullpen on the 31st floor with 5 other analysts, 2 recent graduates from Georgia Tech, one from Emory, one who'd transferred from a firm in New York and never let anyone forget it, and one other scholarship student, a Haitian-American woman named Lena, who had a very precise way of saying nothing when she had something devastating to say. Lena became her first real friend inside the building within approximately 8 days. The work was technical and demanding in the way Amara had expected. Financial modeling, market analysis, internal reports on real estate acquisition strategies across the Southeast Corridor. She was good at it. She was better than good. She had a particular feel for the way numbers told stories that wasn't common in people her age. A combination of formal training and the informal education of growing up in a household where the difference between $60 and $40 in the account was the difference between making it to Friday or not. What she hadn't expected was the access. Kang Global Holdings was structured on paper as a global real estate and technology investment firm with diversified holdings in 7 countries. The real estate division alone had assets across residential, commercial, and mixed-use development, with projects currently active in Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, and 3 markets in South Korea. The technology arm held minority stakes in logistics software and urban data analytics companies. The portfolio was enormous and complex, and the analysis work never stopped. But the firm ran tight, and on the 31st floor there was a very particular kind of silence around certain decisions: project budget transfers, travel schedules for senior leadership, communications that went through the CEO's office that were logged internally as confidential strategic consultation. Amara noticed these things because she noticed everything, because she had grown up in households where missing a small signal early could mean missing the whole story. She also noticed that the CEO came down to the 31st floor more often than the org chart would have suggested. Not always for meetings. Sometimes he just walked through, spoke with people briefly, looked at screens, left. The analyst called it a walkthrough, but the more she watched, the more she thought it looked less like a manager checking in and more like something else. A man taking the temperature of a room, reading something invisible in the micro-behaviors of the people around him. He acknowledged her on her 3rd day with a nod as he passed her desk. On her 6th day, he stopped and asked what she was working on. She told him, specifically and without performance, and he looked at her screen for a moment and made one observation about a variable she hadn't weighted correctly and left. She fixed it. He was right. On her 14th day, he stopped again. "You said you grew up in Vine City." She turned in her chair. He was standing a few feet away, jacket on, hands in pockets, with the air of someone asking a casual question who was not asking casually. Ashby Street, she said, with my grandmother. Still there? She's lived there 47 years. He was quiet for a moment. Come to the 32nd floor at 5. He walked away before she could respond. She told Lena, who gave her a very long look and said, You know who he is, right? In a voice that had careful in every syllable. He's the CEO, Amara said. He's the CEO, Lena agreed, with the tone of someone who meant an enormous amount by the word the. The 32nd floor at 5 o'clock was almost entirely empty. The executive assistants had gone. The meeting rooms were dark. He was in his office with the glass wall and the view that faced south, where on clear days you could see past downtown toward where the city's older neighborhoods bled into each other. And on very clear days you could pick out the specific rooftops of streets that hadn't been renovated and weren't sure they were going to be. He had 2 chairs in front of his desk, and he pointed her to one of them. He sat on the edge of his desk. Not behind it. That detail registered. The West Side Corridor project, he said. I know it, she said. I've been running the community impact comparators for the last week and a half. Then you know the scope. She did. The West Side Corridor project was the firm's largest active development in Atlanta, a mixed-use redevelopment spanning 4 city blocks in the area, bracketed by Vine City and English Avenue, projected to bring high-density residential, retail, and co-working space to what the internal briefs described as an underutilized urban corridor with significant appreciation potential. The project had a 2-year build timeline and a projected return on investment that made the board very happy and the marketing department very busy. It also, according to the acquisition documents she'd been given to review, required the demolition of 11 residential properties on 2 streets. One of those streets was Ashby Street. The relocation packages are structured through third-party housing coordination, she said. I've seen the numbers. I need your assessment, not the numbers, your assessment. Amara looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd had in the interview room, except they were alone now, and there was no director on the other side of the table. Are you asking me because I grew up there, or because you want an honest answer? She said. Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. But almost nothing, from a man this controlled, was the equivalent of someone else's visible reaction. Those aren't separate questions, he said. She breathed for a moment. The relocation packages are 90 days, she said. The comparable housing search assistance covers a 30-mile radius from the original address. In Atlanta's current rental market, at the price points these families are operating at, a 30-mile radius from Vine City means Morrow or Union City, assuming availability. That's an hour commute minimum. Several of the residents are elderly. At least 2 are disabled. One family has children in Booker T. Washington High School. 90 days to relocate with those constraints, in this market, is not a relocation package. It's a deadline. She stopped. He had not moved. There's also the social infrastructure question, she said, because she'd started and she might as well finish. You can't put a dollar value on it in a standard impact model, but it's real. These are people who have lived next to each other for 20, 30, 40 years, who watch each other's houses, who know which neighbor's kid is struggling. The relocation disperses them by default. You don't just move people, you dissolve the whole network. Silence. He was looking at her like she'd said something he'd been trying to find the language for. That's all in the impact assessment, he said. It's in mine, she said. It's not in the official one. Why not? Because the official one was written to reach a predetermined conclusion. The sentence sat in the air between them like something solid. He pushed off the edge of the desk, walked to the window, stood there for a long moment with his back to her, looking south, toward the part of the city that didn't reflect well in glass towers. Send me your version, he said. Tonight. She stood. She picked up her bag. Taijun, he said, still facing the window. She waited. My name, he said. Kang Tae-jun, since we've apparently been skipping introductions. I know, Amara said. I looked you up after the bus. He turned, just his head. And? He said. And I thought the Wikipedia page was probably missing some things, she said. She left. She went downstairs. She sent him the report from the lobby before she got on the train, with the full analysis, the relocation timeline breakdown, the social infrastructure section, and 3 pages of comparative data on communities that had undergone similar redevelopments in other cities and what had happened to the original residents over the following 5 years. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was afraid of having sent it, because she was afraid of what she was beginning to understand about who she'd sent it to, and what the gap was between the Wikipedia page and the truth, and what it meant that none of that had made her want to look away. She learned the truth about Kang Tae-jun in pieces, the way most truths arrived, not as a single revelation, but as a series of small facts that accumulated until the picture they were forming became impossible to ignore. The first piece was Lena, who on a Thursday afternoon in late January told her very quietly, over bad coffee in the break room, that KGH's real estate division had a primary portfolio and a secondary portfolio, and the secondary portfolio had a different kind of investor structure, and the kind of investors in the secondary portfolio were not the kind of people who attended public shareholder meetings or filed transparent disclosures. The second piece was the building's security, not the standard corporate kind. She'd worked in a standard corporate building the previous summer, and she knew what that looked like. This was something else. The men at the lobby desk were not checking badges. They were reading people. The cameras on the 32nd floor didn't blink on a standard cycle. When Tae-jun moved through the building, there was a geometry to the people around him that wasn't organizational. It was protective. The third piece was a name. She heard it first in a half-conversation between 2 senior analysts who didn't know she was around the corner, and the name was Black Tiger, said in English with the particular reverence of a phrase that had been imported from somewhere else. And the conversation stopped the moment she stepped into view. She went home that night and sat at the kitchen table and did what she hadn't fully done after the initial Wikipedia search. She went deeper. Not the corporate press, not the Forbes profile, or the real estate industry citations. She went into the financial journalism archives, the Korean language business press that she ran through a translation tool, the whisper networks of anonymous sources in organized crime reporting that existed on the margins of legitimate outlets and said things that mainstream publications wouldn't print. What she found was not surprising, exactly, but it was heavy. Kang Tae-jun had been born in the Mapo district of Seoul to a mother who worked in a textile factory and a father who didn't stay. He'd left school at 15. He'd moved through the margins of Seoul's criminal underworld during a period of significant restructuring in the mid-2000s, when several powerful organizations had collapsed inward and left gaps that men with nerve and intelligence and an extraordinary tolerance for violence had moved into. He'd built something in those gaps, a network that combined financial sophistication with the kind of enforcement infrastructure that made other organizations want to negotiate rather than compete. By his mid-20s, he'd gone legitimate on paper while maintaining the structural relationships that had built the paper legitimacy in the first place. The Atlanta operation was newer, 5 years, maybe 6, and had been built through a combination of genuine business acumen and a very specific cultivation of city relationships that looked like municipal partnership and functioned like something more complicated. The Black Tiger, known for control, known for memory, known for the specific, terrible fairness of someone who hurt people exactly as much as they deserved and never more, which had somehow made him more feared than the men who hurt people randomly. She sat with all of it for a long time. Then she thought about the bus, the way he'd stood at the fare terminal with his phone declined and his composure intact, but his eyes showing the crack of something unexpected. The way he'd sat across the aisle and said, "I don't accept debts," with total sincerity. The way he'd called her into his office and asked for her real analysis and listened to every word of it. She didn't know what that made him. She didn't know what it made her, that she wanted to find out. She closed her laptop. She looked at the photo of Evelyn on the wall across from the kitchen table. Younger Evelyn, early 70s maybe, standing on the porch of Ashby Street with a broom in her hand and a look on her face like she owned everything she surveyed and wasn't interested in negotiating. Amara looked at that photo for a long time. Then she went to bed. She was back at her desk at 9 the next morning when an email arrived from the executive suite. Report received. See me at 5. She stared at it. She typed back, "I'll be there." She did not mention the name she'd found. The Black Tiger, the archive of translated articles, the weight of everything she hadn't asked him yet. She went back to her models. She counted the hours like quarters. At precisely 5 o'clock, she took the elevator up. And this time, when she stepped onto the 32nd floor, there was a man in a dark suit standing near the elevator bank who had not been there before. And he looked at her with the kind of professional blankness that meant he knew exactly who she was and had been expecting her, and that the walls of this building had more layers than she had yet understood. She walked toward the glass office at the end of the corridor. And somewhere underneath the statistics and the relocation packages and the 47-year history of a house on Ashby Street, something was changing. In her understanding of the world, in her understanding of this man, and in the quiet, terrifying recognition that the line she was about to walk into was going to be much harder to walk back from than the one she'd crossed when she dropped $2.50 into a stranger's bus fare. She put her hand on the office door. She knocked. "Come in," he said. And she did. The office smelled like cold air and something underneath it. Cedar, maybe. Or the specific neutrality of a space that had been designed to give nothing away. The glass wall behind his desk turned the city into a painting. She stood just inside the door and waited. He was at the window again. Different posture than before. Weight shifted, one hand in his pocket, the other loose at his side. He was looking at something specific in the middle distance, not scanning, not thinking. Looking. Like there was a particular building or street or patch of sky out there that he was having a private conversation with. He let the silence run for almost 20 seconds before he turned. "Sit," he said. She sat. Same chair as before. Notebook on her knee out of habit, pen uncapped, though she had a feeling she wasn't going to need either of them. He came around the desk and sat on the edge again, the way he had the last time, which she was beginning to understand was deliberate. A refusal to put the furniture between them, a preference for a kind of engagement that didn't have barriers built into the architecture. He set a printed copy of her report on the desk beside him. She could see her own formatting, her section headers, the highlighted blocks of comparative data. He'd marked it. Red pen throughout. Not corrections, she looked closer. Annotations. Questions. Single words and fragments in a precise, angular script. "You wrote that the 30-mile relocation radius is inadequate," he said. "It is." "My team ran the housing availability models." "Your team ran the housing availability models for the price range in the official relocation package," she said. "The official package is 14% below the actual median rent for comparable units in that radius. So the model is technically correct and practically useless." He looked at her. "That's a direct criticism of work done by people in this firm," he said. "You asked for my assessment." "I did. Then that's my assessment." He picked up the report and flipped to the section she'd titled Social Infrastructure Dissolution. She'd almost changed the title twice, thought it sounded too academic, left it in because it was accurate. He read for a moment, even though she could tell he'd already read it, probably more than once. "You wrote that community networks function as informal safety infrastructure," he said. "You quantified it." "I approximated it, based on studies from 4 comparable redevelopment sites. The social support value, informal childcare, elder assistance, emergency resource sharing between neighbors who've known each other for decades. When you factor that against the cost of formal services that displaced residents have to access in new locations, the number is between $60,000 and $90,000 per household over 5 years. Conservative estimate. That number isn't in any standard impact model." "No," she said, "because it's inconvenient." He set the report down. He looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite frustration. Something between them that didn't have a clean word. "How old are you?" he said. 22. "You write like someone who's been losing arguments with economists for 20 years. My grandmother taught me to argue by making me defend every statement at the dinner table until I could prove it 3 ways, Amar said. It wasn't a comfortable childhood. Something happened in his face. Just a line, a softening at the corner of his mouth that was gone almost immediately. "How many houses on Ashby Street?" 11 in the acquisition zone. 7 of them owner-occupied. 4 rental. The owner-occupied residents have an average tenancy of 31 years. The longest is my grandmother, 47. "Evelyn." She went very still. "You know her name?" "I read the acquisition file." "The acquisition file has the names of property owners." "Yes," he said. She held that. The file. Her grandmother's name in a corporate acquisition file. 47 years reduced to a property identifier and a projected relocation cost. The project isn't mine alone, he said. There are partners, city investment agreements, financing structures with specific performance benchmarks. I know. If I freeze the demolition component, you'll break the timeline on the city partnership agreement and trigger the penalty clauses, she said. I read those too. You're looking at 4 to 6 million in penalties and a restructuring of the tax incentive package that the city awarded the project last year. He didn't react to the number, which meant the number wasn't news. Then you understand what I'm dealing with, he said. I understand what the building is dealing with, she said. I'm asking what you're dealing with. The sentence landed differently than she'd intended, or maybe exactly as she'd intended. She wasn't sure which was more unsettling. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window again, and she let him, because she'd noticed this was how he processed. He needed space and a fixed point, and a minute of silence before he came back to something. Come back tomorrow, he said. 8 o'clock. I want you in the partner review meeting. I'm an analyst. I know what you are. She stood, picked up her notebook, walked to the door. Taejun. His name in her mouth felt strange, too familiar, too much like she'd earned it, which she hadn't yet. Not really. He turned. The residents on Ashby Street don't know yet about the full scope. They've had preliminary notices, but the demolition schedule isn't public. I know, he said. When does it go public? He was quiet for just a beat too long. 6 weeks, he said. She nodded. She left. She rode the elevators down alone and stood in the lobby for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the cool marble pillar beside the security desk, feeling her own heartbeat, counting it down from fast to something manageable, telling herself this was just a job, and the man upstairs was just a client, and the house on Ashby Street was just a property in a file. She was not convincing herself. Oh, the partner review meeting had 12 people in it, and Amara was the youngest by at least 15 years, and the only one who hadn't been introduced by name before the meeting began. She sat at the far end of the table with a legal pad and the internal briefing document she'd been handed at the door, and she didn't speak unless spoken to for the first 40 minutes. The meeting was conducted in a mix of English and Korean with no translation offered, which she suspected was partly practical and partly the organizational equivalent of a locked door. She caught enough of the Korean, 2 semesters of it, plus 3 years of absorbing fragments from the Seoul-based acquisition team who came through quarterly, to follow the structure of the argument even when the specifics blurred. The project timeline, the city agreement, the demolition schedule, the phased construction plan, the projected revenue on the residential units, high density, mixed income on paper, with the affordable unit percentage sitting at 11%, which met the city's minimum threshold by exactly 1 point. 11%. She wrote it on her pad, circled it. The man to Tae-jun's left was Park Sung-ho, the CFO, who had the compact efficiency of someone who had spent decades making uncomfortable numbers look acceptable and had long since stopped finding the discomfort interesting. He walked through the financial model with the brisk specificity of someone who believed the numbers were the whole story. The man to Tae-jun's right she didn't know. Not a regular presence on 31. Not in the org chart she'd memorized. He was introduced only as Mr. Yoon. He was in his 60s, silver at the temples, a quality of stillness that was different from Tae-jun's. Where Tae-jun's stillness was controlled, Yoon's was patient. The distinction, she was starting to understand, was significant. Tae-jun did not look at her for the first 40 minutes. Then Park Sung-ho began the section on community relations, and Tae-jun said, Amara. The room looked at her. She felt each set of eyes without flinching. Analyst's perspective on the community impact numbers, Tae-jun said. To the room, not to her, framing it before she spoke. She put down her pen. She looked at Park Sung-ho's slide, which showed a satisfaction curve and a projected community engagement score that she recognized as meaningless without the underlying data it was supposedly derived from. The 11% affordable unit target is the floor, not the ceiling, she said. And the satisfaction metric on slide 14 is based on surveys conducted in neighborhoods where residents had already been relocated. You're measuring acceptance of the fait accompli, not genuine community impact. Park Sung-ho looked at her with the expression of a man who had been in too many meetings with too many people to show actual anger in a meeting, but whose actual anger was nonetheless clearly visible. The methodology is standard, he said. For projects that have already happened, she said. This one hasn't. The baseline is wrong. The methodology was approved by the city's Partnership Review Office. The city's Partnership Review Office approved a methodology proposed by our consultants. That's not independent validation. Silence. She felt Tae-jun in her peripheral vision and didn't look at him. She looked at Park Sung-ho. I'm not saying the project is wrong, she said, because she'd learned to offer the landing before she burned the bridge. I'm saying the community relations strategy is built on numbers that won't hold up when the demolition schedule goes public. If there's a gap between what the impact assessment claims and what residents experience, that gap becomes a media story, which becomes a regulatory story, which becomes a city council story 6 weeks before an election cycle. The room was very quiet. Mr. Yoon, who had not spoken once in 40 minutes, said something in Korean. Low, brief. Tae-jun responded in Korean. Also brief. She caught 2 words, data and sufficient. Yoon looked at her. He had pale, careful eyes. You are confident in your alternative figures, he said, in clean, formal English. I'm confident in the methodology, she said. The figures are what the methodology produces. Yoon looked at Tae-jun. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. Not agreement, not disagreement. Something older and more textured than either of those. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Park Sung-ho was waiting for her in the hallway outside the meeting room. He had the look of a man who had arranged his face into something professional with considerable effort. You've been here 6 weeks, he said. Yes. The analysis function on 31 supports the executive team. It doesn't contradict it in partner meetings. He asked for my perspective. He asked for an analyst perspective, not a personal agenda. She felt the heat rise in her throat and kept it there. My personal situation isn't driving the analysis. The analysis is driving my concern about my personal situation. Those are different directions. He looked at her for a moment. You're good, he said. You're very good. Don't make it mean less than it is by getting confused about what this is. He walked away. She stood in the hall and breathed. She was not confused about what this was. That was the problem. Tits. She told Lena at lunch in the atrium downstairs, talking quietly over food she was only half eating, and Lena listened the way she always did, completely, without interrupting, with the particular stillness of someone who was processing at full speed behind a neutral face. When Amara finished, Lena ate a bite of her salad. Park's been with him for 9 years, Lena said, since Seoul. I know. Not just CFO. I know what he is, Amara said. Lena looked at her. Do you know about the Yoon family? Tell me. Don't Google it at work, Lena said. Don't Google it at home on your Wi-Fi either. Go to the public library and use their terminals if you actually want to know. Amara looked at her. That's serious. I like you, Lena said. I'm telling you because I like you. The project has investors that are not on any public filing. The Yoon family is one of 3 that are not on any public filing. You just sat in a room with one of them and disagreed with his CFO about data methodology. Amara put down her fork. Okay, she said. Okay, Lena agreed. Eat your food. She went to the library on Saturday. She used a terminal in the back corner near the reference stacks, the one that faced the wall, and she spent 3 hours reading everything she could find about the Yoon family. The public version, which was thin and strategic, a construction magnate with interests across East Asia and 2 sons and a reputation for philanthropic activity that was photographed often and documented vaguely. And then the less public version, which existed mostly in translated excerpts of Korean financial crime reporting and a long, carefully hedged investigative piece from an international financial press outlet that had published 2 years ago and been cited nowhere else. The Yoon family's construction arm had a history of involvement with infrastructure projects in cities with weak regulatory environments. In 3 of those cities, the projects had been preceded by what the article called community clearance operations, rapid displacement of existing residents through a combination of legal acquisition and what the reporting characterized as informal pressure, without specifying what informal pressure meant in operational terms. She read it twice. Then she sat in the library with the screen in front of her and thought about Tae-jun at his window, his annotated copy of her report, the red pen questions in the margins. Come back tomorrow, 8 o'clock. I want you in the meeting. She didn't think he knew all of it. She thought he might know more than she could see, and less than she needed him to, and that the space between those two things was where the real danger lived. She thought about her grandmother at the kitchen table, the Sunday call, the way Evelyn always ended the call with, "It's going to be fine, baby," without Amara ever specifying what it was. She deleted the browser history, even though she knew it probably didn't matter. She walked home through the early February cold with her hands jammed in her pockets and her mind moving fast and nowhere useful. Monday morning, she was at her desk at 8:50, running numbers, when the email came. Not from Taejun. From an address she didn't recognize. A personal Gmail account. No signature, no context. Just a document attached and 3 words in the body of the email. "For your records." She looked at the attachment for a long moment without opening it. Then she opened it. It was a copy of the demolition permit application for the West Side Corridor project. Not the summary she'd been given as part of her analyst briefing. The full application with appendices. The demolition scope she'd understood to cover 2 streets in the acquisition zone, 11 residential properties. This document listed 17. She read it again. 17 properties. 6 more than what was in the internal materials she'd been given. 6 more houses. More families. More names in an acquisition file she hadn't been shown. Her hands were completely still on the keyboard. She was aware of her own breathing, the specific sound of it in the quiet of the floor, the way it had slowed and deepened without her telling it to. She forwarded the document to her personal email from a private browser window. She closed the window. She sat for another minute looking at the screen. Then she picked up her phone and sent a 1-line text to Lena. "We need to talk, not here." She didn't go to the 32nd floor that day. She sat at her desk and ran models and answered emails and spoke to no one she didn't have to speak to, and underneath all of it, she felt the ground changing the way it does before something structural gives, that low vibration that isn't quite sound and isn't quite sensation, but registers in the body as warning. Taejun called her cell at 4:53. She looked at the screen, let it ring twice, answered. "You didn't come up," he said. "I was working. I told Park the methodology issue needed to be addressed in the next revision." She said nothing. "Amara, I need to ask you something," she said, directly. A pause. "Go ahead." "The demolition scope in the acquisition documents I was given. The internal briefing says 11 properties." Silence. "Is that the complete list?" she said. The silence went 3 seconds, 4, 5. "Where did you see a different number?" he said. Very flat, very controlled. "Is 11 the complete list?" she said again, because she was not answering that question. Not yet, not until he answered hers. 6 seconds, 7. "Come to the office," he said. "Tell me here." "Amara, 17, she said. "I'm looking at a demolition permit with 17 properties on it. That's 6 families who aren't in any briefing material I've been given. So I'm asking you directly, did you know or didn't?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. Amara stood in the middle of the 31st floor bullpen with her phone pressed to her ear and the silence on the other end of the line running long enough to become its own kind of confession, and she felt something in her chest go very cold and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "Amara," his voice came back, careful in a way it hadn't been before. "Come to the office." "You knew," she said. Not a question, not even an accusation. Just a fact she was setting down between them like something she couldn't carry anymore. "It's more complicated than—" She hung up. She stood there for 3 seconds with the phone in her hand and the office noise around her. Keyboards, a phone ringing 2 desks over, someone laughing in the kitchenette, and none of it touched her. She was in a separate atmosphere. She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened on the 32nd floor. Taejun was standing there. He must have moved the moment she'd hung up, taken the stairs or the secondary elevator, positioned himself here before she could get out of the building, and she registered this fact with the part of her brain that was still functioning analytically, that he'd anticipated exactly what she would do and had moved to intercept it, and the rest of her just felt the specific fury of being known well enough to be managed. "Get in," he said. "No. I'm not asking you to listen to an excuse. I'm asking you to let me explain what actually happened. Those are the same thing." "They're not." He put his hand on the elevator door to hold it. 5 minutes. She looked at him. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was working very hard at something, a quality of focus that had physical weight that pressed against the space between them. He was not performing. She'd learned enough of his tells by now to know when he was performing and when he wasn't, and this wasn't. She stepped out of the elevator. She did not go to his office. She went to the small meeting room across the hall, the one with frosted glass and no view, and she sat in the chair furthest from the door and put her bag on the table in front of her like a barricade, and she waited. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of the table with his hands in his pockets and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's about to say out loud for the first time. The 17 properties weren't in my original acquisition scope, he said. The 6 additional addresses were added to the demolition permit application 4 months ago by the city partnership liaison on the project, Marcus Webb. He expanded the demolition boundary to accommodate a revised infrastructure plan, underground utility corridor, water main rerouting. The decision was made at a level below my direct oversight, and the documentation was filed under a sub-permit category that routes through the city office, not through my executive review. She listened to every word. And when did you find out? She said. The pause was shorter this time. 8 days ago. 8 days. She'd been sitting 40 feet below him for 8 days, running models on the project, eating lunch in the building, taking his calls, and he had known for 8 days. You didn't tell me, she said. I was trying to understand the full scope before. I live on one of those streets, she said. My grandmother lives on one of those streets. You had 8 days. He didn't look away. She gave him credit for that, in the small part of her that was still capable of giving him anything. I know, he said. Is Ashby Street in the 6th? A beat. Yes. The word landed in her sternum like something blunt. She had prepared herself for it on the walk down from the library, on the elevator ride up just now, in the 3 seconds she'd stood in the bullpen after he went silent on the phone. She had been preparing herself for it in the specific way she'd always prepared for bad news, by calculating it in advance, by making the number real before it arrived so that when it did, the shock would be smaller. She had done all of that, and it still hit her like a body blow. 47 years. Evelyn's broom on the porch, the velvet furniture and the cedar smell and the photographs on every surface going back to the 80s. She breathed through her nose. She kept her face very still. Who sent me the document? She said. I don't know. Take a guess. He pulled out the chair beside him, not at the head of the table, not across from her, beside her, which she noted and which she didn't know what to do with. He sat down. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at her directly. There are people in this project who don't want me reconsidering the scope, he said. People with significant financial exposure. If someone sent you that document, it was to force the situation, to make sure you found out before I could control how you found out, so that your response would be emotional rather than strategic. My response is emotional, she said. And strategic. I can do both. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the shadow of one. I know, he said. That's what makes you dangerous to them. Who is them? He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Yunjae Sik's family holds 23% of the secondary financing on this project. The return on that investment is tied to the original timeline and the original demolition scope. Any reduction in scope or extension of timeline reduces their return and triggers a renegotiation clause that gives them grounds to pull out. And if they pull out, the primary financing structure collapses. The city partnership agreement becomes unenforceable. The project dies. And your losses. Substantial, he said, without elaborating on the number, which meant the number was very large. She looked at him. So you've known for 8 days that the scope includes my grandmother's house, and you've been trying to find a way to fix it that doesn't cost you the project. Yes. Have you found one? No, he said. Not yet. The honesty of it was almost worse than the lie would have been. She could have hated a lie cleanly. This she had to sit with. She picked up her bag. I need to go home. Amara, I'm not quitting, she said, because she could see the question forming. I'm going to go home and sit with my grandmother, and I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to do it. And I'd suggest you use the same time to figure out which side of this you're actually on. She left him sitting at the table. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Amara got home, making rice and something with okra that smelled like every good thing that had ever happened in this house. The television in the other room was on too loud the way it always was because Evelyn's hearing had gotten worse since last year, and she refused to admit it. The kitchen light was yellow and warm, and the window above the sink showed the back of the neighbor's oak tree, bare in February, its branches making the same pattern against the evening sky they'd made every winter Amara could remember. She sat down at the table without saying anything, and Evelyn looked at her once, from the stove, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned the burner down. "What happened?" Evelyn said. "I'm working on something." "That's not what I asked." Amara looked at her hands on the table. Her grandmother's hands were in her peripheral vision, thicker at the knuckles than they used to be, moving with the particular economy of someone who had cooked 10,000 meals in this kitchen and knew exactly where everything was without looking. "Have you gotten any letters from the city?" Amara said, "or from a company called Kang Global Holdings in the last few months?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "There was something, a while back, about the neighborhood project. I threw it away." "You threw it away?" "Baby, I have thrown away every letter about neighborhood projects since 1987. You know how many times people have come through here with plans for this neighborhood?" She set a lid on the pot. "I'm still here." Amara looked at her grandmother's back, the set of her shoulders, the gray in her hair that had come in slowly over the past 5 years, and that she wore the way she wore everything, without comment, without apology. "It might be different this time," Amara said. Evelyn turned around. She looked at Amara with the specific attention of a woman who had raised children and buried a husband and navigated 50 years of a city's worth of other people's decisions affecting her life, and who had developed over that time a very precise instrument for detecting when someone she loved was trying to protect her by not saying a thing. "Tell me," Evelyn said. So Amara told her. Not everything. Not Taejun's other life, not Yoon, not the secondary financing structure, but the project, the scope, the demolition schedule, the 6 additional properties that had been added 4 months ago and that put Ashby Street inside the acquisition zone. Evelyn listened, standing up, leaning against the counter with her arms folded, and her face didn't break. It didn't collapse or crumple or do any of the things Amara had been bracing against since she'd walked through the door. It went still. A particular kind of still that Amara had seen before. The stillness of a woman who had learned very young that falling apart was a luxury that didn't always come back. When Amara finished, Evelyn said, "How long do we have?" "I'm working on it." "Amara." "I don't know yet." "I'm working on it." Evelyn nodded once. She turned back to the stove. She turned the burner back up. "Wash your hands," she said. "Dinner's in 10 minutes." They ate at the kitchen table. Evelyn talked about Mrs. Patterson next door, whose granddaughter had just gotten into Spelman, and about the oak tree in the back that needed trimming before spring, and about a recipe she'd seen on television that she wanted to try if she could find the right kind of pepper at the store. She talked the way she always talked, with the specific warmth of someone who loved the texture of ordinary life and intended to keep living it. Amara ate and listened and felt the house around her like a physical thing. She got the call at 7:43 the next morning while she was on the MARTA platform. It was a number she didn't know. Atlanta area code. "Ms. Brooks?" A man's voice. Smooth, unhurried, with the quality of someone who is accustomed to his calls being received on the first ring. "My name is Yoon Jae-sik. I believe you've been made aware of my involvement in the West Side Corridor project." She stood very still on the platform. The train was 2 minutes out. She could feel the change in air pressure in the tunnel. "I'm aware," she said. "I wanted to introduce myself," he said, "in the spirit of transparency, since you've been doing such thorough work on the community impact analysis." The way he said thorough, like a word with teeth in it. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to have a conversation," he said, "about your continued involvement in the project, and about what that involvement looks like going forward." "I'm listening." "Not on the phone," he said. "I'd like to meet. Today, if possible. There's a restaurant in Buckhead. Lunch." "I have work." "I've spoken to Mr. Kang this morning," he said. "Your schedule is free." She absorbed that. Taejun had cleared her schedule, or Yoon had told her he had, which was its own kind of message. 12:30, she said. Perfect, he said. I'll send the address. The train came. She got on. She stood holding the bar above her head and watched the dark tunnel wall move past the window and thought about the specific geometry of what had just happened. The call she hadn't expected, the name she'd read in the library, the schedule cleared without her knowledge, the restaurant in Buckhead where a man she'd never met wanted to have a conversation about her continued involvement. She texted Lena. Yoon called me. 3 seconds. Then, don't go alone. Then, actually, go. But tell someone exactly where you are. She texted the address to Lena when it came through. Then she sat down when a seat opened up, and she looked at her own reflection in the dark window across the train, and she did something she'd been doing since she was 17. She ran the calculation. What she had, what she was up against, what she could and couldn't afford to lose. The calculation kept coming back to the same answer. She couldn't afford to lose any of this, and she was about to lose all of it. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu because if you needed to see the price, you'd already answered the relevant question about yourself. Yoon was already at the table when she arrived, in a dark suit with a pocket square she recognized was probably worth her monthly rent, and he stood when she approached, which was a courtesy that felt like a warning. He was older up close, early 70s maybe, with the careful posture of a man who had maintained his body the way he maintained everything as an instrument of function. His eyes were the pale color she'd noticed in the meeting room, and they moved over her with an assessment so rapid and thorough it was almost clinical. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," she said, because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of the alternative. They sat. He ordered tea. She ordered water. The waiter disappeared. "You're very capable," he said. Not a preamble, not small talk, just the opening move of a man who didn't do small talk. "The analysis work you've done on the West Side Project is genuinely impressive. I've read it in full. I didn't know it had been shared with you." "Tae-jun and I share most things," he said. "We've known each other a long time." She kept her hand still on the table. "What is it you wanted to talk about?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the meeting room, patient, deliberate, like he was reading something just below the surface of what she was showing him. "I want to talk about what you're planning to do with the demolition document you received." She said nothing. "You received a document," he said pleasantly, "that contains information beyond your analyst briefing. You have forwarded that document to a personal email account. You are, I suspect, in the process of determining how to use it to alter the project scope in a way that would protect a small number of residential properties at the cost of a financially significant outcome." He could see every move she'd made before she'd made it. She kept her face neutral and thought about how he'd known about the email forward, which meant either the firm's IT infrastructure was being monitored in ways she hadn't accounted for, or someone very close to her had told him. "What I do with information I receive is my own decision," she said. "Of course," he said. "Everything is a decision. I'm here to make sure you have complete information before you make yours." He took a sip of his tea, set it down with the precision of a man who placed every object deliberately. "Tae-jun has built something extraordinary. You know this. What you may not fully appreciate is how many dependencies exist beneath what you can see. The financing structures, the relationships that make those structures possible, the people who have invested not just money, but significant personal exposure into this project." "Katis Satsiet-san." "Are you threatening me?" she said. He smiled. It was a genuine smile, which was more disturbing than a fake one would have been. "I'm explaining context," he said. "A project of this scale has consequences when it fails. For investors, for city partnerships, for the organization that runs it." He paused. "And for the people who are part of that organization." She heard it, felt it settle. "I'm an analyst," she said. "You are an analyst who has become considerably more than an analyst in a very short time," he said. "That's not a criticism, it's an observation. The relationship between you and Tae-jun is," he paused, chose a word, "visible, to people who understand what they're looking at." She felt the heat move into her face and controlled it. "I don't know what you think you're observing. I think I'm observing a young woman of considerable intelligence who is about to make a decision based on personal loyalty to a street and a grandmother." and who does not yet fully understand what happens to people who create problems for certain kinds of investors. He said it without inflection, without drama, the way someone states a weather forecast. The waiter came back. Yoon ordered something. She didn't. When the waiter left, she looked at Yoon directly, and she thought about Evelyn at the stove with her back straight and her arms folded, and she thought about 47 years and a broom on a porch. And it's going to be fine, baby. And she thought about everything she'd calculated and recalculated since she was 17 years old, and she said, "Mr. Yoon, I appreciate the context." He waited. "But I want you to understand something clearly," she said. "My grandmother is 73 years old, and she has lived on Ashby Street for 47 years. She has buried a husband from that house. She has raised children from that house. And someone, somewhere in this project, added her street to a demolition list without authorization and without disclosure, and filed it as a sub-permit to avoid executive review. That is not a financing concern. That is a decision by someone in this chain to make 11 families invisible in order to expand a utility corridor by 40 feet. She kept her voice level, completely level. If you're asking me to let that disappear because of financial exposure, the answer is no. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're certain," he said. "Yes." He set his napkin on the table, stood, which meant the lunch was over before the food had arrived. "Then we have a problem," he said. "I want you to think carefully tonight about what that problem looks like, for everyone involved." He left. She sat alone at the table in the restaurant in Buckhead and felt the shape of what had just happened close around her like a room getting smaller. Her phone buzzed. Tae-jun. She looked at the screen. She answered. "How did it go?" he said. "Did you know he was calling me?" A pause that told her everything. "He told me this morning he wanted to speak with you directly. I couldn't stop. You cleared my schedule." "Amara." "He told me it was visible," she said. "You and me." He used that word. Visible. Silence. "Is that a threat?" she said. "To me, or to you, or to both of us?" The silence ran 4 seconds. 5. "Come to the office," he said. "I'm done coming to the office when things get difficult," she said. "I need you to tell me right now. Are you going to fix this project, or aren't you?" 6 seconds. "I'm trying," he said. "Trying isn't an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She pressed the phone against her ear so hard she could feel her own pulse. Outside the restaurant's glass front, she could see Peachtree Street in the February gray. The cars moving, a man in a yellow jacket walking fast with his head down. The ordinary city going about its completely ordinary. She hung up. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. She just took the phone away from her ear and ended the call and sat in the empty restaurant in Buckhead with the February light coming flat through the glass, and the waiter hovering at a respectful distance holding a menu she had never opened. Trying isn't an answer. She'd said it, and she had meant it, and she had nothing left to say after it. She put $40 on the table for the water she'd drunk, and the table she'd occupied, and the waiter's time, which was $40 she didn't have to spare, and she left. She walked 2 blocks before she realized she was walking in the wrong direction. She stopped on the sidewalk with people moving around her, and she breathed. In, out. The cold air hit the back of her throat like something medicinal. She turned around. She had 3 hours before the community meeting. She hadn't known about the community meeting 48 hours ago. She'd found it through Lena, who had found it through a neighborhood Facebook group that someone had shared in the firm's anonymous internal message board, a thing that technically wasn't supposed to exist and absolutely did, where analysts passed information in the specific, careful way of people who understood they worked inside a building with very good surveillance and very selective vision. The Vine City Community Coalition. Monthly meeting, Friendship Baptist Fellowship Hall, 7 p.m. This month's agenda, West Side Corridor Development Update. Guest speaker from the City Partnership Office, Marcus Webb, the liaison who had expanded the demolition boundary, who had added 6 properties to a sub-permit without executive review. Who was going to stand in front of 200 residents tonight and present a development update that did not include the information Amara had read in that permit application? She knew what she was going to do. She had known since she'd sat in the library and read about Yoon's family history. She had been building toward it without naming it, assembling the pieces, the report, the document, the data, the 3 pages of comparative analysis she'd done on her own time over the past 2 nights, the timeline of decisions, and the names attached to each one. She had the document. She had the analysis. She had a community meeting at 7 o'clock, and a man named Marcus Webb who was going to walk into that meeting unprepared for what was about to happen to him. She called Lena. "I need a printer." "My apartment is 4 blocks from the meeting hall," Lena said, without asking why. "Come now." Tunt. Lena's kitchen table was covered in pages by 5:45. The demolition permit, the original acquisition scope and the revised one, side by side, with the 6 additional properties highlighted. The relocation package analysis. The affordable unit percentage comparison against the city's stated affordable housing goals. The social infrastructure impact model. The Yoon family financing structure, redacted to remove what Amara couldn't prove and leaving only what she could. 22 pages. She stacked them into 12 packets. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway watching her with a cup of coffee and an expression that was equal parts respect and anxiety. "You know what this does?" Lena said. "Yes." "To the project. To your job." "Yes." "To him." Amara looked up. "He's been trying to find a way to fix it that doesn't cost him anything," she said. "He hasn't found one, so I'm going to go make the cost of not fixing it higher than the cost of fixing it. That's the only math he understands." Lena was quiet for a moment. "And if he doesn't come down on the right side of it?" "Then I'll know," Amara said. "And I'll have done what I could." She finished stacking the packets. She put them in her bag. She looked at Lena. "Don't come," she said. "You don't need to be in this." "I know," Lena said. "I'm coming anyway." The fellowship hall was a converted community center on the edge of Vine City with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs and the kind of acoustic ceiling tiles that absorbed sound unevenly so that voices near the front carried clearly and voices in the back became a general murmur. By 6:50, there were close to 200 people in the chairs, more standing along the walls, and the specific energy of a room where most people didn't know yet that they were about to receive information they weren't going to like. Amara stood near the back wall with Lena and watched the room fill. She recognized faces. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who was sitting in the 3rd row with her hands folded and her good coat on. The Diallo family from 2 streets over, 3 generations worth, grandmother, mother, and the teenage boy who mowed Evelyn's side yard in the summers for $20 and a plate of food. A cluster of men near the windows who she knew by sight as the informal block association of English Avenue, who showed up to every community meeting because their fathers had shown up to every community meeting before them, and that was simply what you did. She did not see Evelyn. She had not told Evelyn she was coming tonight. She had not been able to make herself have that conversation. Marcus Webb arrived at 6:58. He was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, light-skinned, with the specific grooming of a city official who understood that appearance was credential and had invested accordingly. He had an assistant with a laptop and a portable projector, and he moved to the front of the room with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this before, who had stood in rooms like this and delivered information to communities like this and walked out afterward without the information touching him. He set up his presentation. Amara looked at the room. She looked at the faces. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the way Evelyn had turned the burner back up and said dinner's in 10 minutes, and talked about Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter getting into Spelman. She reached into her bag. Mom. Webb started at 7 on the dot. He had a slide deck, professionally produced, with the city's seal and the Kang Global Holdings logo side by side in the header, which Amara noted with a particular feeling she couldn't name. He talked about economic development. He talked about job creation. He talked about mixed-income residential opportunity and urban revitalization and community investment and every phrase that had been deployed in every neighborhood in every American city to describe the process of replacing one kind of people with another kind of people while making it sound like progress. He was good at it. She had to give him that. He had the cadence of it, the particular fluency of someone who had absorbed the language so completely that he'd stopped hearing what it was replacing. He was 12 minutes in when Amara raised her hand. Webb looked at her. "Questions at the end, please." I have a document question, she said. It won't take long. Questions at the end. It's about the demolition scope, she said, and the room shifted. Not dramatically. Just a change in the quality of attention, a leaning in, a stilling of background noise. Webb kept his voice pleasant. Ma'am, we'll have a full Q&A. The demolition permit filed with the city 4 months ago lists 17 residential properties in the acquisition zone, Amara said. The materials your office has distributed to this community list 11. I'd like to know which number is accurate. Silence. Not the silence of a room processing something, the silence of a room that has just had something confirmed that it had been trying not to fully believe. Webb looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Rapid calculation, the specific micro-panic of a man whose preparation had not included this. The project scope documents available to residents reflect, I have the permit, she said. She held it up. I have copies for the room. She started passing packets down the rows. The room broke open. Not into chaos, into the specific urgent noise of 200 people talking at once, the rustling of papers being opened, the sound of voices finding the relevant pages, the particular pitch of a room discovering something it was supposed to have known and wasn't told. Mrs. Patterson was on page 2 already. The Diallo grandmother was holding the packet at arm's length and reading with the intensity of someone who knew exactly which street they were looking for. Webb tried to regain the front. If everyone could just... His voice was too thin against the noise. These documents are out of context. My name is Amara Brooks. She moved toward the front of the room. Not to take it over, to be visible, to be a person with a body and a face and a grandmother on Ashby Street. I'm a corporate strategy analyst at Kang Global Holdings. I grew up on Ashby Street. My grandmother Evelyn Brooks has lived in the same house on that street for 47 years. She looked at the room, not at Webb. 6 weeks ago, I started working on the community impact analysis for this project. What I found is in those packets. The demolition scope is larger than what you've been told. The relocation packages are inadequate for the current rental market in this city, and the decision to expand the boundary was made without the knowledge of the firm's chief executive. Webb, that is absolutely not... Then correct me, she said. She looked at him directly. In front of these people, correct any specific thing in those documents. He looked at her. He looked at the room. He looked at his assistant, who had the expression of someone who understood that the evening had moved completely outside the architecture of the plan. He did not correct anything. The room had found the pages with the addresses. She could hear it happening. Names read aloud, cross-referenced, the specific tenor of recognition when someone found their street. Then from the third row, Mrs. Patterson stood up. She was 68 years old and barely 5'3", and she had a voice that carried like something structural. My family has lived on English Avenue for 31 years, she said. 31 years of every project and every promise and every meeting in this same hall. Every single time. She held up the packet. I want to know who decided to add these 6 streets without telling anybody. I want a name. The room. Name, name, name. Not chanting. Just the word, passed person to person, person to person, like something on fire moving through dry grass. Webb was sweating. She could see it from here. The shine at his temple, the way he'd stopped touching his clicker. The boundary revision was a technical infrastructure decision that went through proper city channels. Whose name is on the permit application? Amara said. He looked at her. It's a public document, she said. Your name is on it. I have it on page 4. The room turned to page 4. Webb's face did something she had no adequate word for, a kind of structural failure, a collapse of the surface that had been holding everything in its professional place. He picked up his laptop. He said something to his assistant. He walked toward the side door. The room came to its feet. Not violently. With the particular force of people who had been sitting down for a very long time and had decided collectively to stand up. Someone near the back of the room shouted, "You don't get to just leave." Someone near the front. 47 years, my father built that house. And then from the side of the room, a voice Amara recognized before she saw the face, a voice she would have known in a burning building in the dark. Amara. She turned. Evelyn Brooks was standing just inside the side door, in her good coat, with her handbag over her arm. She had come on her own. Of course she had. She was 73 years old and had been attending community meetings in this hall for 30 years, and she hadn't needed Amara to drive her then, and she didn't now. Their eyes met across the room. Evelyn gave her one nod. Slow. Absolute. Like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. Amara turned back to the front. Webb was gone. His assistant was packing up the laptop with the hunched efficiency of someone trying to be invisible. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 200 people who were still on their feet, and she said, "You deserve representation in what happens to your neighborhood, every single one of you. And what I can tell you tonight is that I am taking everything in those packets directly to the executive leadership of this project, and I am not leaving that meeting until there is a commitment to a public review of the demolition scope." She held the room's gaze. This is not over. This is the beginning of it being over. The room was loud, and then it was louder, and then Mrs. Patterson sat down and said something to the woman beside her in a low voice and started writing in a notebook, which was somehow the most clarifying thing Amara had seen all night. Lena appeared at her elbow. "Your phone," she said quietly. "It's been buzzing for 10 minutes." Amara looked at the screen. 11 missed calls, 7 from a number she didn't recognize, 4 from Tae-jun, and 1 text from Tae-jun, sent 40 minutes ago, that read, "Yoon is moving tonight. Get out of the meeting. Call me now." She stared at it. Lena read it over her shoulder. "What does that mean?" Lena said. Amara didn't know. She knew what moving meant in the abstract. She'd read enough of the archived reporting. She'd had Yoon sitting across from her in Buckhead with his careful eyes and his pleasant smile and his "we have a problem." She knew the word had operational weight in certain contexts. She didn't know what it meant tonight, specifically aimed at what she'd just done in this room. She called Tae-jun. He picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" "Still at the hall. What's happening?" "Yoon contacted Park an hour ago. He's calling the financing." His voice was tight in a way she had never heard it. Controlled, but just barely, the way a wire sounds when it's holding more than it was built for. "If he pulls the secondary financing tonight, the primary structure goes into default by morning. The city will suspend the partnership agreement. The entire project goes into receivership." "That means—" "It means he's burning it," Tae-jun said. "He's burning the project to punish the deviation from scope. If he can't have the project on his terms, he doesn't want it to exist." She processed this. "And the residents. If the project goes into receivership, the acquisition agreements become active, but the redevelopment stalls. The properties are in legal limbo. Some families will have taken relocation payments already. They won't be able to move back. The ones who haven't taken payments are in a zone that belongs to a receivership estate with no development plan and no timeline. Worse than the original demolition. A legal gray zone that could last years. Families displaced into uncertainty with no structure around it, no protection, no plan. She felt it in her chest, the particular weight of a move she hadn't anticipated. "What are you doing?" she said. "I'm calling in a board meeting, emergency session, tonight." "Can you stop him?" A pause. "I don't know." "Tae-jun, I don't know," he said again. "He has the contractual right to call the financing under the deviation clause. If the board agrees that a material deviation from scope has occurred, has it? You published internal documents at a public community meeting," he said. "Yes, that's a material deviation." The sentence hit her in a very specific place. Not because it was wrong, because it was right, and she'd known it was right when she'd done it, and she'd done it anyway. "Then what do you need from me?" she said. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I need you to trust me for the next 4 hours. That's a lot to ask. I know. After 8 days and 17 properties and Yoon and Buckhead and cleared schedules, I know," he said. "I know all of it. I'm asking anyway." She looked at the room around her. People were still talking, still on their feet, still holding the packets she'd printed at Lena's kitchen table. Mrs. Patterson was on her phone. The Diallo grandmother was explaining something to her daughter with the precise, urgent gestures of a woman who had been waiting her whole life to say this specific thing out loud. Evelyn was near the side wall, talking to 2 women Amara recognized as block association leaders. And even from across the room, she could see that her grandmother was not afraid. She was the opposite of afraid. She was in her element, the element of a woman who had been in this hall for 30 years, and knew every face and every story and was not under any circumstances done. 4 hours, Amara said. Yes. And then what? And then I either fix it or I don't, he said. And if I don't, you'll have everything you need to take it further. I won't stop you. She breathed. Where's the board meeting? She said. 32nd floor, 40 minutes. I want to be there. Amara, see, I want to be in the building, she said. I don't have to be in the room, but I want to be there when it happens. Silence. Lobby, he said. 30 minutes. She hung up. She looked at Lena. I have to go. I know, Lena said. Go. She crossed the room to Evelyn. Her grandmother saw her coming and turned, and Amara took both of Evelyn's hands in hers, which was not something she did often, and Evelyn looked at her with those eyes that had seen everything and lost things and kept going. I have to go finish this, Amara said. Evelyn squeezed her hands once. Then go finish it, she said. She held her grandmother's hands for one more second. Then she let go and walked out into the February night and started moving toward the street, toward the car she'd get on the app, toward the glass tower on Peachtree that reflected the city so cleanly it looked like it had eaten it whole. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Brooks. A woman's voice. Professional, flat, with the specific affectlessness of someone reading from a prepared statement. This is a message from Yoon Jae-seek. He would like you to know that the board has been informed of tonight's community meeting and the distribution of proprietary firm documents. He would also like you to know that a formal complaint has been filed with Georgia State Bar authorities regarding potential unauthorized practice in conjunction with, I'm not a lawyer, Amara said, the falsification and distribution of restricted corporate documentation. She stopped walking. Those documents weren't falsified, she said. Mr. Yoon believes the framing constitutes material misrepresentation and will be pursuing all available remedies, including potential civil action against... She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk outside the fellowship hall, with the cold air on her face and the sound of 200 people still audible through the walls and the specific isolated feeling of someone who had just understood that the ground they were standing on had been moving this entire time, quietly, incrementally, and was now moving very fast. Civil action. Proprietary documentation. Her name on a formal complaint in a city where she needed her scholarship and her degree and her future to remain intact. Yoon had moved, and the move wasn't against Tae-jun, it was against her. She was 22 years old, she had $41 in her account and a grandmother who still thought the worst was manageable and a stack of copied permits she'd printed at Lena's kitchen table, and the most powerful investor in the room had just pointed every legal instrument he had at her specifically, which meant he had assessed her specifically, which meant she had done more damage tonight than she'd understood when she'd done it. Her hands were shaking. She held them still. She looked at the fellowship hall. She looked at the city stretching out beyond it in every direction, lit up and indifferent and enormous. She looked at the car icon on her phone app, 4 minutes away. She breathed. Then she called Tae-jun back. Yoon filed a complaint, she said when he picked up, against me personally. Falsification, misrepresentation, civil action. The silence on his end was 3 seconds long and had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Something hard and sudden, like a door closing on something. Say that again? He said. She said it again. Another silence. When he came back, his voice was different, not louder, not emotional, colder. The specific cold of a man who had just crossed a line inside himself that he hadn't known he was standing near. Get in the car, he said. Come to the building. Don't stop for anything. Tae-jun, he just made this personal, he said. That was a mistake. The car arrived. She got in. The driver didn't speak. The city moved past the windows in streaks of light, and she sat in the back seat with her bag on her knees and her heart rate at a number she didn't want to count. And she thought about Yoon's pleasant smile in the restaurant and the word visible, and we have a problem, and now a legal complaint with her name on it filed before the meeting was even over, filed while she was still standing in that room, which meant he'd had it prepared in advance, which meant he had anticipated tonight, which meant someone had told him she was going to be there. Someone had told him. She thought about who knew she was going to that meeting. Lena. And she stopped that thought immediately, because Lena had come with her, had stood beside her, had said, I'm coming anyway. Not Lena. Who else? She'd told no one else. She'd found the meeting through the anonymous internal board. She'd looked it up from her work computer. The work computer. She looked out the window at the city going past. The car pulled up to the Peachtree Tower at 9:23. She got out. The lobby lights were on, and two men she recognized from the executive floor security team were standing inside the glass doors, which meant the building was on some kind of alert status, which meant the board meeting was real and already in motion. She pushed through the doors. One of the security men stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks, Mr. Kang asked us to bring you to—" "I know where to go," she said. She went to the elevator. She pressed 32. The doors opened on a floor that was lit and moving. 3 executive assistants at their stations. 2 men in suits she didn't recognize standing near the secondary conference room. A low-level thrum of contained urgency that she could feel in the floor under her feet. Park Sung-ho was standing in the corridor outside the main boardroom. He saw her, and something crossed his face. Not surprise, not quite. Something more complicated than that. "You should go home," he said. "No," she said. "This is above—" "I know what it is," she said. "Yoon filed a complaint against me. I have a right to know what's being decided in that room." "You have no rights in there," he said, not unkindly, just accurately. "You're an analyst. You're not a party to the board structure." "Where's Tae-jun?" Park looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved once, as if testing a word and deciding against it. Then he stepped aside. She walked past him to the boardroom door. She could hear the voices inside. Korean, rapid, with the compressed intensity of people who had set aside everything else and arrived at the essential argument. She heard Tae-jun's voice once, cutting across the others with a sharpness she'd never heard from him in meetings. Not anger, something more controlled than anger, more dangerous than anger. She put her hand on the door. Park said behind her, "If you go in there, it can't be undone." She thought about $2.50 in a bus fare box. She thought about 47 years and a broom on a porch. She thought about a legal complaint with her name on it filed while she was still standing in a room full of people who deserved to know the truth about their own street. She thought about Tae-jun's voice on the phone. He just made this personal. That was a mistake. She pushed the door open and walked in. The boardroom had 8 people in it, and the specific atmosphere of a space where something irreversible had already been set in motion. 3 men she recognized from the quarterly partner meetings. 2 she didn't. Park Sung-ho came in behind her, which she hadn't expected, and the fact that he followed instead of stopping her told her something she filed away immediately. A lawyer, identifiable by the document stacks and the particular stillness of someone being paid by the hour to listen, sat at the far end with a yellow legal pad and an expression trained to reveal nothing. Tae-jun was standing at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, not relief, something between them that didn't have a name yet and probably wouldn't for a long time. He looked like a man who had been in this room for 40 minutes doing something that cost him, and who had just been handed a reason to keep going. Yoon Jae-sik was seated to the right, midway down the table. He looked at Amara with those pale, patient eyes and said nothing. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, perfectly still, like a man who had already won and was waiting for the room to catch up. She walked to the far side of the table, opposite Yoon, and she stood there. She did not sit. She put her bag on the floor and she stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Tae-jun and said, "Tell me where we are." Tae-jun said, "Mr. Yoon has invoked the deviation clause of the secondary financing agreement and formally notified the board that he is calling his family's position. That triggers a 48-hour cure period during which the firm must either restore the original project scope or find replacement financing." "And replacement financing," she said. "In 48 hours, Park said from behind her, "is not possible." "Which means the project goes into default," she said. "Which means," Tae-jun said, "that the question before the board is whether to restore the original scope or accept the default." She looked at Yoon. "Restoring the original scope means the demolition proceeds as originally planned, all 17 properties." Yoon said pleasantly, "The original scope was agreed upon by all parties. The deviation was unilateral." "The deviation was a disclosure," she said, "to residents who had a legal and ethical right to that information. The deviation was the distribution of proprietary corporate documentation at a public meeting," Yoon said, in the same pleasant tone. by a junior analyst with no authorization, which exposed the firm to significant legal and reputational liability and constitutes a breach of. You filed a legal complaint against a 22-year-old in the hour before this meeting, she said. Before the meeting was even over. You had it drafted in advance. She looked at the room, not just at Yoon, at every face around that table. What does that tell you about how this process has been managed? Silence. The complaint is a procedural matter, Yoon said, separate from the board discussion. It's not separate, Tae-jun said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't moved from the head of the table. His voice was even and quiet and had the specific weight of someone who had made a decision and was now simply executing it, the way you execute something you've thought through completely and can't take back and don't want to. The complaint, Dates, he said, is a direct attempt to intimidate a witness to project mismanagement. Marcus Webb expanded the demolition boundary without executive authorization. The documentation of that expansion was filed through a sub-permit category specifically to avoid my review. That decision, not Ms. Brooks's disclosure of it, is the material breach. He looked at Yoon. The question is not whether to restore the scope. The question is why the scope was altered without my knowledge and who benefited from the alteration. Dorishimam. The room went very still. Yoon's hands were still flat on the table. His expression had not changed, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted. The patience in it became something different, something with an edge. You're conflating operational decisions with governance matters, Yoon said. The utility corridor expansion added 40 linear feet to the infrastructure plan, Tae-jun said. It also added 2 additional city parcels to the land clearance that were adjacent to properties already held by a development LLC registered in Delaware. That LLC's beneficial ownership structure includes a holding company connected to your family's construction arm. He paused. I spent the last 4 hours finding that. The room was absolutely silent. Amara looked at Yoon. She watched him process what had just been said, watched the pleasant surface hold while something underneath it recalculated its speed. That's a significant accusation, Yoon said very quietly. It's a finding, Tae-jun said, supported by 6 documents, 2 of which are public filings and 4 of which are internal. The lawyer at the end of this table has copies. He looked at the lawyer, who nodded once without expression. The boundary expansion didn't benefit the project's return metrics significantly enough to justify the risk of community opposition. It benefited a private land position that was already in place before the expansion was filed. Marcus Webb didn't make that decision alone. Yoon said nothing. I want the complaint against Ms. Brooks withdrawn, Tae-jun said. Tonight, as a condition of any further conversation about the financing structure. You're not in a position to make conditions, Yoon said. You need my financing. I needed your financing yesterday, Tae-jun said. Tonight I need your signature on a withdrawal, because if I don't have it in the next 30 minutes, every document in this room goes to the city's ethics office and the financial crimes division of the DA's office before midnight. He looked at Yoon with the specific steadiness of a man who had spent years in rooms exactly like this, who knew precisely what pressure felt like and how much of it was required. And I think we both know that's a conversation you don't want to have. The silence ran for 10 seconds. 15. Yoon looked at Tae-jun, then he looked at Amara, and the look was not pleasant anymore, not patient. It was the look of a man who had made an assessment and arrived at a conclusion he didn't like. He looked at his own lawyer, a small man at the corner of the table who had been so still Amara had nearly forgotten he was there. Something passed between them. The lawyer opened his case and removed a single sheet of paper. The complaint will be withdrawn, Yoon said. As a gesture of goodwill, contingent on no contingency, Tae-jun said. Unconditional withdrawal. Sign it. Another silence. Yoon signed it. The lawyer handed it to Park, who walked it to Amara. She looked at it. Her name, crossed out of the complaint header. Yoon's signature below. She folded it once and put it in her bag and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the document didn't already say better. The financing, Yoon said, is being called, Tae-jun said, as you invoked. That stands. He looked around the table. The board will vote on whether to accept the default and restructure or to find an alternative path. That discussion happens without Mr. Yoon in the room. Yoon looked at him for a long moment. You understand what this costs you? Yes, Tae-jun said. Everything you've built here. The city relationship, the project, the return structure. I understand what it costs, Tae-jun said again. You can go. Something moved across Yoon's face, the closest thing to genuine emotion she'd seen from him. And it wasn't anger, it was something more like recognition, the look of a man who had just understood that the person across from him was not, in fact, the same person he'd been dealing with 6 months ago. Or perhaps the same person making a choice that 6 months ago he wouldn't have made. Yoon stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the door with the same composed posture he'd entered with, and he did not look at Amara again, which she understood was its own kind of acknowledgement. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. The board meeting ran until 1 in the morning. Amara sat in the small meeting room across the hall, the one with frosted glass and no view, the one she'd first heard the true shape of things in. And she waited. Park brought her coffee at 10:30 without being asked. She drank it. She looked at the frosted glass and listened to the muffled sound of voices she couldn't make out, and she did the thing she always did when she was waiting for something she couldn't control. She ran numbers, not project numbers, personal ones. What she had, what she might lose, what she could rebuild and what she couldn't. Her job was probably gone. She understood that. Even if Tae-jun survived the board vote and restructured the project, she had walked into a partner meeting with unauthorized documents, distributed them publicly, and contributed directly to the collapse of a major financing relationship. The organizational math on that was not ambiguous. Her scholarship required a current employment record in good standing for its corporate partnership component. If she lost the job, she had 60 days to find a replacement or the stipend component would be suspended. Evelyn's house, if the restructure went wrong, could still be in a legally ambiguous zone for months. She added it up. She sat with the total. Then she thought about Evelyn saying, "Go finish it," and the way her grandmother's hands had felt in hers for that 1 second in the fellowship hall. And she thought about 200 people on their feet with packets of paper. And she thought about Mrs. Patterson writing in her notebook. And she thought about what it had felt like to stand at the front of that room and say the thing that needed saying. She did not think she had been wrong. She did not know yet what not being wrong was going to cost her. At 1:14, the boardroom door opened and Tae-jun came out alone. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, and not physically, or not only physically. A tiredness that went deeper than sleep could fix, the specific depletion of someone who has spent years maintaining something at great internal cost and has just watched a significant piece of it come apart. He came into the small meeting room and sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. She let him have the moment. The board voted to accept the restructure, he said. We absorb the financing loss. The city partnership goes into renegotiation. The project continues with a revised scope and a revised timeline. The demolition. Suspended. Full stop. He looked at his hands on the table. The board agreed to a community review process before any demolition decisions are finalized. Representative inclusion. Binding input from residents on the scope. She absorbed this. All 17 properties. All 17 are under suspension pending the review. He paused. Ashby Street is in the suspension zone. She looked at him. Webb has been terminated, he said. The city ethics office will receive the documentation about the LLC structure. What they do with it is their process, not mine. But they'll have everything. Yoon is gone from the project. The legal and financial consequences of the LLC situation are his to manage. He looked up. He will manage them. He has resources and lawyers and distance I can't close, but he won't come back at you. That's the trade he made when he signed the withdrawal. She nodded slowly. Your job, he said, and stopped. I know, she said. The board position is that the distribution of internal documents constitutes a terminable breach. I argued against it. I was outvoted. He said it straight, without softening it, which she appreciated more than she could say. I'm sorry. She sat with it. The specific weight of it, 60 days, scholarship component, Evelyn's house in the suspension zone, but her own future on a different kind of clock. Okay, she said. He looked at her. That's all. What else do you want me to say? She wasn't angry. She was just tired and clear in the way you get clear when everything non-essential has been burned off. I knew what I was doing when I did it. I knew what it might cost. I did it anyway. Why? He said. She looked at him. Because the alternative was knowing and saying nothing, and I can't do that. I've never been able to do that. It's probably the most expensive thing about me. He was quiet for a moment. It's not a flaw, he said. Tell that to my scholarship committee. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the ghost of warmth behind the exhaustion. I'll write the letter myself, he said, to the scholarship committee. A full account of the community impact work, the analysis, the contribution to the scope revision. No mention of the termination reason. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know, he said. I'm doing it anyway. A pause. It won't fix everything. Nothing fixes everything, she said. You just fix the next thing. He looked at her across the table in the small room with the frosted glass. And the city was quiet outside. And the building was almost empty. And they had been through something together that neither of them had names for yet. And the air between them felt different from how it had felt when she'd first walked into this firm. Heavier, but also more honest, which was the exchange you made when you stopped pretending. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The black tiger. She said it plainly, the way she said everything plainly. What you are, what the secondary portfolio actually is, the Yoon relationship, and what it was before it was a financing structure. She looked at him. I need to know how much of what I've been working inside. He didn't look away. He didn't reach for a version of the truth that was easier to hand over. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific steadiness of a man who has been asked the question he has been not asking himself for years. And he said, more than I want to tell you, less than you probably think. And I've been trying, for longer than you've been in this building, to make the line between the two things permanent instead of permeable. He paused. I haven't finished. Are you going to? Yes, he said. Simply. No qualification. She believed him. She wasn't sure she should, and she believed him anyway, which told her something about herself that she filed alongside everything else she'd learned in the last several months. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time. The dark circles, the loosened collar, the particular look of a man who has just paid a very large bill and is not sorry he paid it. Get some sleep, she said. You too, he said. She took the elevator down alone and walked out into the Atlanta night, which was cold and clear and smelled like the city after rain, though it hadn't rained. She stood on the Peachtree sidewalk for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and the emptiness of 1:30 in the morning around her, and she looked up at the glass tower reflecting nothing but the night sky, and she thought, that's done. That specific thing is done. Everything else was still ahead of her. She called an app car and went home. The months that followed were not gentle and they were not cinematic. They were just work, which was what life mostly was when you looked at it honestly. Amara filed her scholarship documentation with Taejun's letter and a supplemental package she built herself. The community impact analysis, the full scope of the revision she'd contributed to, 2 letters from community coalition members, including one from Mrs. Patterson, that was 3 paragraphs long and did not waste a single word. The committee reviewed. They deliberated for 11 days. They reinstated the stipend component on the condition of continued academic standing, which she had, which she maintained. She found a new position. Not immediately, not easily. It took 6 weeks and 4 interviews and 1 very long conversation with a professor from her finance program who knew people at a community development financial institution in Midtown that did impact-focused real estate lending. The work was less prestigious and paid 60% of what KGH had paid and required her to be on the MARTA before 7 every morning, and she took it without hesitation. Lena texted her the day she started. First day, how is it? She texted back, real. Lena responded, good. The West Side Corridor project entered its community review process in March. Amara was not part of it professionally, but she went to the public meetings as a resident, as a woman from Vine City whose grandmother lived on Ashby Street. And she sat in the rows instead of at the front, and she listened. And when she had something specific to say, she said it, and her analysis was in the public record and the review committee had read it, and she felt the weight of that in a different way than she'd felt the weight of it inside the building. Cleaner, somehow. More honest about what it was. The review took 4 months. The final revised scope retained 9 of the 11 original residential properties in the acquisition zone. 2 were required for the utility corridor infrastructure, and those families received a significantly expanded relocation package, developed in consultation with the community coalition. The 6 additional properties were entirely removed from the demolition scope. The affordable unit percentage in the revised plan was raised to 28%, which was not everything anyone had asked for, and was substantially more than the 11% that had been filed the previous year. Evelyn's house stayed. Amara was on the MARTA when she got the text from Mrs. Patterson with the final review decision, and she read it twice. And then she looked out the window at the city moving past and let herself have 30 seconds of something she didn't usually allow herself. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the specific quiet recognition that a thing she'd fought for had happened. That she had stood in a room and said the true thing, and it had cost her, and the cost had been worth it. 30 seconds. Then she put her phone in her bag and went to work. She saw Tae-jun twice in those months, not counting the formal contexts. The first time was accidental. She was coming out of a coffee shop near her new office, and he was on the sidewalk across the street, not in a suit, which was disorienting, in a dark jacket and without the geometry of protective personnel around him that she'd come to unconsciously read as his silhouette. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and they both stopped. He lifted one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement. She nodded. He nodded. She went back to work. The second time was deliberate. She had finished her last final exam of the spring semester on a Thursday afternoon in late April, a finance theory paper she'd spent 3 weeks preparing for and had walked out of feeling, for the first time in years, that she had not been running behind the entire time. She had sat on the steps outside the exam hall in the April sun for 20 minutes just breathing, with her bag on her lap and nothing urgent happening, which was so unusual a state that she didn't quite know what to do with it. Then she'd walked to the coffee shop on Peachtree where she'd been working 4 shifts a week on top of the MARTA institution job, and she'd worked her shift. And at the end of the shift, when she was wiping down the counter, she looked up, and he was there. He was standing in the line. Regular line. No assistant, no bodyguard she could identify, just a man in a dark jacket in a coffee shop line at 6 in the evening, looking at the menu board with the particular attention of someone who didn't usually have to stand in lines and was recalibrating. She watched him for a moment without him seeing her. He looked different. Slightly. The same jaw, same controlled stillness, but something in him that had been clenched for the entire time she'd known him was slightly less so. Like a door that had been locked from the inside and had recently been, not opened, but unlocked. The difference was subtle, and she saw it immediately. When he reached the counter, it was her station. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "What can I get you?" "Coffee," he said. "Whatever you recommend." "That's not how ordering works," she said. "You have to pick." The corner of his mouth moved, the ghost of a smile that she'd learned to read as the real one. "Dark roast," he said. "No sugar?" She made it. She set it on the counter. He paid with his phone, which worked this time, and she noted that without comment, and he noted her noting it, and neither of them said anything about it. He moved to the pickup end of the counter, but didn't leave. He stood there with the coffee in his hand and looked at her with an expression that had too many things in it to catalog efficiently. "The review passed," he said. "I know. The community fund is being capitalized next month, $12 million. The coalition will have independent governance of the allocation. I saw the press release. I structured it so the fund survives any future change in the project's ownership," he said. "It's held by the city trust, not by the firm." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said. She wiped the counter. Someone came up behind him and she took that order and made that drink, and when she looked back, he was still there, holding his coffee, watching her work with that quality of attention he'd always had, the kind that felt like being genuinely seen rather than assessed, which was a distinction she'd spent a long time learning to trust. When the brief rush passed, she came back to his end of the counter. "I've been looking for excuses to come here for 2 months, he said, without preamble, without the controlled flatness he used when he was managing how much he was revealing. She looked at him for a moment. "That's not a very efficient use of your time." No, he said. You could have just come. I know, he said. I wasn't sure you'd want me to. She considered this. The honesty of it. The specific vulnerability of a man who did not do vulnerability and had done it anyway, standing at a coffee shop counter in April with a dark roast he hadn't needed to come here for. I have 40 minutes left in my shift, she said. I'll wait, he said. He sat at the small table near the window, the one that faced the street, where the late April light came in at an angle that made the ordinary things look slightly more considered than they were. He drank his coffee slowly. He watched the street. Occasionally he looked at her, and she occasionally looked back, and neither of them made anything of it, which was somehow the most honest exchange they'd had. At 6:53 she untied her apron and got her bag and walked to the table. He stood when she approached, which she knew by now was just how he was, a formality so habitual it had become genuine. They walked out onto Peachtree together. The April evening was warm and the city was doing its ordinary evening thing, people moving in every direction with the specific energy of a Thursday when the work week is almost over. Buses and cars, and the distant sound of something happening on a stage somewhere that she couldn't identify. They walked for half the block without saying anything. The scholarship is secure, she said. I know, they told me when I filed the letter. You followed up? Yes. She looked at the sidewalk in front of her. You didn't have to do that either. Amara. He said her name the way he'd said it the first time in his office, like something he'd decided to keep. I'm aware of everything I didn't have to do. I'm choosing to do it anyway. Those are different things. She looked at him sideways. That sounds familiar. Where did you hear that? Someone said something like it to me once, about 250 on a bus. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Is this where you tell me we're even? No, she said. This is where I tell you I don't keep that kind of score. He looked at her. Full on, not sideways. That direct, weighted look that she'd first seen on a city bus in November when his phone had declined and the whole scaffold of his regular life had briefly, visibly failed him. I'm trying to become something different, he said, from what I was. It's not fast. I know, she said. I've been watching. And? She thought about it. About the man in the boardroom at 1 a.m. who had said yes when she'd asked him if he was going to finish what he'd started. The way he'd said it, simply, without performance, the way you say a thing when you've stopped trying to manage how it lands. And I think you mean it, she said, which doesn't mean I know how it turns out, which doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. He nodded, slowly, like a man accepting the terms of something real rather than negotiating for better ones. They had reached the corner where her MARTA stop was. She stopped. He stopped. There's a community coalition meeting next week, she said. Tuesday. Vine City. The fund governance structure is on the agenda. I'm going. I know, he said. I was asked to present. I know, she said. I'm on the invite list. He looked at her. So I'll see you there, she said. Yes, he said. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. She looked at him one more time. The loosened jacket, the unlocked quality, the dark eyes that had assessed her on a city bus in November and had not, in the end, been able to look away. Taejun, she said. Yes. Get some sleep before Tuesday, she said. You look better when you've slept. Something moved across his face, the real smile, the one that only came when he wasn't trying to manage it. She'd seen it maybe 4 times in 6 months, and it was still startling, the way it changed him. Good night, Amara, he said. Good night, she said. She went down into the MARTA station. She did not look back because she didn't need to. She knew he was still standing there, because that was also just how he was. The train came. She got on. She found a seat by the window and watched the dark tunnel give way to the elevated section where the city opened up below, the lights of Atlanta spreading out in every direction. The streets she knew and the ones she didn't, and the ones that had almost been erased and weren't, the ordinary and the survived and the still becoming, all of it mixed together under the same April sky. She had $41 in her account this time last year. She had more now, not much more, but more. She was working 2 jobs and finishing her degree and eating actual meals and sleeping actual hours, and had a letter of recommendation from a Korean Mafia boss turned restructured real estate developer in her permanent file. which was the strangest credential she could imagine and probably the most genuinely earned thing she had. She had Evelyn. She had Lena. She had a community fund being capitalized next month with independent governance. She had a house on Ashby Street that was still standing. She had the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, with a man who was trying to become something different and meant it, who had stood in a boardroom at midnight and paid the price she hadn't asked him to pay, who had come to a coffee shop for 2 months looking for reasons before he finally just walked through the door. She had the city, complicated and relentless and real. She had everything she'd fought to keep and nothing she hadn't fought for. And the train moved through the Atlanta night carrying her home, to the house on Ashby Street where Evelyn would have the kitchen light on and the television too loud, where the cedar and old coffee smell would meet her at the door, where 47 years of living were in every surface and photograph and worn piece of furniture. She had $2.50 worth of beginning. The rest of it she'd built herself. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.